I've read a lot about the screams that once echoed through the stone halls of medieval dungeons. Cries that told stories of pain so intense it almost defied belief. But none of those sounds, none of those torments, could compare to what came from one particular device. A tool so devilishly simple and yet horrifyingly effective that just hearing its name today can still make your blood run cold. Deep in the shadows of castle dungeons and religious prisons scattered across Europe, in places where justice wasn't about fairness but about how much agony a confession could yield, there existed one instrument that stood out above the rest. It was the ultimate example of human cruelty turned into mechanical art. They called it the Pear of Anguish, a name that sounded almost harmless until you learned what it actually did. This gruesome invention came from craftsmen who once used their metalworking talents for beauty and progress, only to twist those same skills into the creation of suffering. The Pear of Anguish was their masterpiece of pain, a dark union between medieval creativity and the cold, organized brutality of the time. While other torture tools crushed bones or stretched limbs, this one worked on a subtler, more sinister principle, one so cruel that most victims begged for death long before the end. Imagine, if you can, a device no bigger than your fist, shining faintly with the polished gleam of carefully maintained steel. At a glance, it might have looked like an ornate metal fruit, something decorative, even harmless to an untrained eye. But beneath that simple appearance hid a clever system of screws and springs designed to transform that little object into something capable of unimaginable torment. For all the talk about how primitive the Middle Ages were, the minds that created this thing achieved a level of calculated cruelty that would make even modern interrogators recoil in disgust. Every part of the pear's construction revealed the cold precision of its makers. Each segment was crafted to expand outward when a central screw was turned, slowly widening the device once it was inserted into the body's most sensitive openings. Some versions were lined with spikes or sharp ridges, ensuring that as the metal spread, it tore into delicate flesh with sickening accuracy. Other variants had hidden barbs that dug into the tissue, making removal a new ordeal of pain all its own. What truly set this device apart wasn't just its mechanical cleverness. It was the psychological torture it brought with it. Unlike other instruments that caused immediate, overwhelming agony, the Pear of Anguish worked gradually. It built suspense, horror, and dread with every tiny twist of the screw. The first insertion, though humiliating and painful, was something the victim could still endure. The first turns of the screw caused pressure sharp, but not yet unbearable. It was only after a few moments, as the device began to expand, that realization dawned on them. Their real suffering had only just begun. Old court records and church archives still hold accounts of how this thing was used across medieval Europe. Heretics felt its bite when they challenged the church's power, their screams echoing through narrow corridors as inquisitors demanded confessions to heresy. Women accused of adultery or moral offenses were subjected to it as well, their bodies turned into unwilling battlegrounds for twisted notions of purity and punishment. But the Pear wasn't just about physical torment, it played a much larger role in maintaining control. Beyond torture, it was a symbol, a message. Its very presence in a dungeon's collection of tools spread fear like wildfire, a more effective deterrent than any law ever could be. People knew that stepping out of line might not just mean imprisonment or death, it could mean losing every shred of dignity in the most degrading way imaginable. The men who made these devices held a strange, unsettling place in medieval society. They were respected craftsmen, often hired by churches or kings, who used their knowledge of mechanics not for progress, but for suffering. The Pear of Anguish stood as their crowning achievement, requiring a level of craftsmanship as exacting as the best clockmakers of the time. Each one was handmade, with differences in size, spike design, and expansion method customized for specific purposes or the preferences of particular interrogators. And while we often focus on the pain of the victims, it's worth remembering the toll it took on the men who used them, because to operate such a thing you had to quiet a part of your soul. I've always found it fascinating how executioners and torturers lived on the edge of society, not quite part of the civilized world, but not fully outcasts either. They occupied the strange middle ground between order and savagery, doing the dirty work no one else dared to do, yet being feared and avoided by the very people they served. Many of them built up elaborate rituals or moral justifications for their trade, convincing themselves they were instruments of divine justice or protectors of social stability. For some, the pear of anguish probably offered a kind of mental cushion. Its mechanical operation gave the illusion that the pain wasn't inflicted by their own hands, but by the device itself. The old trial records tell us that the pear wasn't just used haphazardly, it was part of a carefully designed system of interrogation. The most experienced inquisitors knew that sometimes the idea of pain could be just as powerful as pain itself. They'd bring prisoners into a cold chamber, make them watch as the device was demonstrated on someone else, or even just let them hear the metallic creak of the screw being turned. Imagination, after all, could conjure horrors far worse than reality. That was all part of the plan. This psychological groundwork weakened the prisoners long before the torture ever began. By the time the real questioning started, many had already broken down, their terror doing half the work. What made the pear so devastating wasn't only the pain it caused, but how deeply it violated a person's sense of self. Back then, ideas of honor and purity were tied tightly to the body, to remain whole, untouched, unbroken. The pear shattered that completely. Its invasive design didn't just hurt the flesh. It desecrated what people believed made them human. Those who survived, and there weren't many, carried wounds that went far beyond the physical. The trauma lingered in their minds, a kind of haunting that no priest's absolution could erase. They were living reminders of what happened when the machinery of justice turned against the individual. Interestingly, the pear wasn't uniform across Europe. Each region seemed to leave its own signature on the design. In Italy, craftsmen were famous for creating versions with complex expansion systems, small mechanical marvels of cruelty. In the Germanic states, the focus leaned toward aggression. Sharper spikes, rougher edges, faster expansion. The French, ever inventive, added small internal chambers that could be packed with powders or irritants, heightening the victim's agony in new and creative ways. Every version revealed as much about its culture's craftsmanship as it did about its tolerance for suffering. When you look at the pear in the wider framework of medieval justice, you start to see the twisted logic of that world. Unlike modern courts, which at least claim to separate justice from revenge, the medieval system treated suffering as a sacred ingredient of punishment, an echo of divine wrath. The pear of anguish was that belief made solid. It turned an abstract idea, God's retribution, into cold, mechanical fact. The old documents that survived, testimony from victims, witnesses, even inquisitors, give us chilling glimpses of what those sessions were like. They describe not just the mechanics of the torture, but the atmosphere surrounding it. The slow, deliberate pace, the tension of each turn, the way humiliation and terror blended into something almost ceremonial. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were rituals designed to break the human spirit layer by layer. Even the people who used the device had to be trained for it. That's something most folks don't think about. Torturers weren't just sadists running wild. They were trained professionals who understood anatomy, pain thresholds, and how to stretch suffering without killing too soon. The pear of anguish, in particular, demanded real precision. Used carelessly, it could end a life too quickly, which would defeat its purpose entirely. And that's where the true horror lies. When you study something like this closely, you realize it wasn't just about cruelty. It was about control, order, and belief twisted into something monstrous. The pear became more than a tool of torture. It was a mirror held up to the human soul, showing how far reason and faith could go when guided by fear. Maybe that's why, even now, centuries later, its story still unsettles us. It forces us to confront a truth we'd rather ignore, that cruelty, when wrapped in the language of justice, can seem disturbingly reasonable. When you trace the history of the pear of anguish, you can see a grim evolution, one that mirrors humanity's growing understanding of anatomy and pain. The earliest versions were crude, almost primitive things, little more than metal wedges that relied purely on brute force. But as time went on, and as inquisitors demanded more refined ways to extract the truth, the design began to change. Craftsmen poured their knowledge into these devices with a level of care and precision that, in any other field, might have been called artistry. By the 14th century, the pear had become a small mechanical masterpiece, terrible in purpose, but astonishing in construction. The most advanced versions were fitted with delicate gear systems that allowed torturers to control the expansion by tiny increments. Each turn could increase pressure by just a fraction of an inch, keeping a victim teetering on the edge of unbearable agony for hours, even days. The psychological toll of that slow, measured suffering was staggering. Prisoners quickly realized that the pain wasn't going to stop. It was simply going to keep getting worse. That realization alone could drive a person to madness. But torture in those days wasn't always carried out in shadowy corners. It was often a performance, a ritual wrapped in ceremony and authority. The use of the pair, like other forms of punishment, sometimes took place before audiences made up of clergy, nobles, or even curious townsfolk. These public spectacles served purposes far beyond morbid entertainment. They reinforced the social order, reminded everyone where power truly lay, and turned cruelty into a kind of shared moral theater. A lesson dressed up as divine justice. Religion, as always, had its own strange role in all of this. Church law technically forbade priests from spilling blood, which led to a horrifying loophole. Methods that tortured the body from the inside were considered acceptable. The pair fit that requirement perfectly. Because it expanded internally without necessarily breaking the skin, inquisitors could claim their hands were clean. They could preserve their spiritual purity, even as they presided over acts that would have made hardened executioners sick to their stomachs. The real genius or madness of the device lay in how it weaponized fear. People didn't have to experience it to break. Just seeing it, hearing it described, or knowing it was waiting in the next room was often enough to crush someone's will. Many confessed to crimes they hadn't even thought about committing, desperate to avoid the agony that awaited. In that sense, the pair was more than a torture device. It became a psychological instrument of control, a cornerstone of medieval law enforcement. Over time, entire workshops across Europe built their reputations around making these devices. In Nuremberg, for instance, smiths were known for crafting pairs with remarkable mechanical precision, engineering that rivaled early clockwork. Meanwhile, Venetian artisans, with their flair for beauty even in darkness, made their versions almost artistic, polished metal, ornate details, gleaming finishes. It was as if they couldn't resist turning horror into a twisted form of craftsmanship. These regional variations revealed not only different technical traditions, but also how each culture viewed the unsettling relationship between beauty and brutality. Even maintaining one of these devices required expertise. Dungeon keepers kept careful records, logging which devices were in working order, which springs needed tensioning, and whether the spikes were sharp enough. They'd clean and oil the metal regularly to keep the gears from rusting, ensuring smooth, reliable operation. It was maintenance, yes, but of suffering. And, of course, money played a role in all of this. The best pairs were expensive, sometimes costing as much as a small fortune. Only the wealthiest courts or powerful religious orders could afford them. Smaller jurisdictions either used rough imitations or borrowed from neighboring authorities when they needed to make a particularly strong impression. In a twisted way that created a hierarchy of pain, the rich could afford to torture with precision, while the poor had to rely on blunt instruments of suffering. The people who operated these devices went through training that was as coldly methodical as the machinery itself. Apprentices learned every mechanical detail, how to turn the screw just right, how to sense when a victim was close to breaking but not dying. It was a grotesque mix of engineering and psychology. Over time, some torturers became masters of their craft, guarding their knowledge closely and passing it down like a family trade. Generation after generation, they refined not just the devices, but the art of breaking a human being without ending their life too soon. Different interrogators had their own approaches, too. Some preferred to escalate things quickly, a burst of terror to shatter resistance. Others believed in the slow grind, in letting the victim's mind unravel before the body gave out. No matter the method, the pair of anguish stood at the center of it all. A small, polished embodiment of everything dark and methodical about medieval justice. When I think about it now, it's hard not to shudder at how far people went to rationalize cruelty. The device wasn't just a tool. It was a reflection of the age that built it. Clever, devout, merciless, and convinced that pain could somehow reveal truth. That belief that suffering could purify or justify is what makes the story of the pair so haunting even now, because it reminds us that when cruelty hides behind the mask of righteousness, it doesn't just belong to the past. It's a shadow that still lingers, waiting for another age to call it justice.